Hello, I'm William Magnusson of the National Institute for Amazonian Research in Brazil. I've been asked to talk about threats to biodiversity, and obviously there are too many to talk about in a short period. So today I want to talk about one that I think is an existentialist threat, and it affects not only biodiversity but the tools that we can use to study biodiversity. And it has the unfortunate characteristic that it can also turn very well-meaning people into threats to biodiversity conservation. Let me start by introducing you to a very cute little friend of mine. I went to the bathroom for a pee. It was dark, and something came along and started snuffling at my foot. I thought, well, what's that? It turned out to be a baby possum. Well, I thought, oh, well, she'll be all right. But then when she turned up in our clothes basket and started sleeping there, I thought, well, she's obviously an orphan, and maybe I should help her. Okay, this gives me really good feelings, and I'm going to probably learn a lot about possums by interacting with them. But I want to emphasize that this is not conservation. It's attending to my human feelings, to doing what feels right, and not necessarily what is right for conservation. Possums are common, and the species is under no threat. It won't make any difference to the species whether I save this baby or not. A possum will live several years, and in that time she will probably produce 10 to 20 young. So within her lifespan, that only about 10 to 20% of her young have to get to maturity to replace her and her partner and maintain the population stable. Here is another orphan I took care of several years ago, and I got great pleasure from her, and I learned a lot about the species. However, chakalakas are not endangered, so I cannot attribute my actions to conservation. Many of the things that we do that make us feel good have very little to do with conservation. And in some cases, those feelings are making people do things which are bad for conservation. What's wrong with the humanist approach to conservation? The problem is when we impose values that are important to humans, we devalue other life forms. Many people are thinking about what is important to humans, and the overwhelming theme is group membership. People are using this knowledge to influence what we eat and the politicians we vote for. They can do that because their responses are generally automatic and determined at a very young age. They can get what they want by pushing the right buttons, and what feels right to us may not necessarily be right for conservation. If you're interested in learning a bit more about how our basic instincts influence what we do, the choices we make, you might take a look at this book. It's very simplistic, but it's written by a person who makes a great deal of money by getting people to buy the products of his employers. It is about how our culture, combined with our basic instincts, can lead us to make very bad decisions. Our mobile phones give us instant gratification and simplified superheroes who very often are just maladjusted pop stars or football players. If manipulating our basic instincts can lead us to make decisions that are not in our best interest, imagine how likely it is that they can also make us take decisions which are not in the best interest of biodiversity conservation. Urbanisation has led to most people not having much contact with macroorganisms. In some senses, this is good because it leads to urbanites usually giving more value to mutualisms than to exploitation, to dominance, which is a norm in agricultural or hunting societies. However, it also means that they tend to substitute the reality of biodiversity for sanitized images of cartoon characters and household pets. I'm going to show you a few videos that I took in the wild. They are basically about death and sex. But I suspect that you are not going to be very emotionally taken by these videos. Let's see. You may have found them interesting, but if you're an urbanite, your subconscious was probably disturbed by the predation, and being a human, you probably weren't turned on by the sex. But these are things that happen all the time in biodiversity, and biodiversity conservation is about maintaining these processes, and not about saving Bambi. Raphael, the author of the book I showed you, says that our basic emotions are determined at a very young age. And this is disturbing because it means that my scientific publications probably have very little emotional effect on my adult scientific readers. In Brazil, it's necessary to have a biology degree to legally exercise many activities, such as environmental impact assessment. However, you can get a biology degree without ever having come in contact with a macroscopic organism. Very few of the students who enter our postgraduate ecology course have ever dissected an animal or made executs of plants they have collected. Many become disturbed if fieldwork requires them to be out of internet contact for more than a day. I am very attached to my family pets, and I spend a great deal of time and money to keep them happy and healthy. However, the positive feelings I get when I'm observing organisms in the wild have nothing to do with the feelings I have for my pets. I was brought up in a family with an ethic of hunting and fishing, and I spent a lot of time interacting directly with organisms in nature. I suspect that that is why I decided to become a biologist. Today, domestic animals tend to have many more rights than their wild relatives. Domestic cats are responsible for the deaths of billions of animals every year, and in some cases, the extinction of entire species. However, welfare laws impede the control of cats in many places, and many well-educated people are against cat control. Why is the life of one domestic cat more valuable than the hundreds or thousands of individual wildlife that it will kill in its lifetime? One reason is that they enter our emotional space very early on, and for many urbanites they represent the only contact that they will have with a macroscopic organism. Raphael tells us that many of the emotions that can be tapped into to control our buying or our political attitudes are determined before we are 7 years old, and many of them are associated with security and mother love. Cats are good at tapping into those codes, and people interacting with cats secrete oxytocins, which is the same chemicals that lead to mother love and mother-young bonding. For this reason, when I show you this image, you will probably say that you are sorry for the bird, but it will not affect the emotions you feel for the cat. While supporting in theory biodiversity conservation in general, the emotion that most urbanites feel for wildlife is associated with cartoon characters and domestic animals. When it comes to making hard decisions, Raphael says that we use what he calls the reptilian brain, and the life of one cat will be worth more than hundreds of birds or lizards. People will vote for what makes them feel good, and not necessarily what is good for biodiversity or even for humanity. Culture determines which organisms deserve our pity. I can get permission to kill hundreds of fish, or even legally go out and torture fish in what is called sport fishing. But I may have great difficulty in getting a permit to capture even 10 mammals. Urbanites are gaining control over wildlife authorities, and they know how to manipulate the media. Soon, most serious conservation actions may be illegal, as these well-meaning people try to impose their values on others. Wayne King, a leading conservationist, told me that he once had a conversation with the director of an international welfare organization. That person said that he did not care if the last individual of a species went to extinction as long as it died humanely. Many people who are seriously interested in biodiversity would not agree with that opinion. It's not only undomesticated animals that have rights. Indigenous people often live in intimate contact with biodiversity, and they also have rights. They consider themselves part of and not separate from nature, and death is a part of life. Bambi was born to die. How can we reinsert people in nature? Obviously, this is not going to be done only by professional wildlife biologists. We need the support of many lay people who can take children out into the real world, even if it's only an urban park, and give them real world experience with biodiversity. And they will not be hijacked by people with simplistic messages, people who are interested only in their own feelings and immediate gratification, and not in the real world of life and death. This is a scene from a recent course we gave for people who live in a sustainable development reserve. most have had very little contact with wild organisms. The instructor is a police officer. However, he probably has more effect on conservation through education than through repression. The young person handing him the snake had never had contact with live reptiles before. And I'm sure that in future years he will have a much greater effect on conservation in the reserve than either of his parents, who were hiding behind a tree and could not even look at the snake. Sustainable use of wildlife can have great outcomes. Most of the national parks in Europe only have wildlife today because they were maintained as hunting preserves for centuries. However, it may be difficult to convince urban parents of the practical value of interacting with wildlife on a commercial basis. However, there is a lot of evidence today that forest bathing, that is contact with the wild, even in areas which don't have a lot of trees, has great effects on health. Maybe that can be used to convince parents to let their children go into the park. The parents aren't worried about the child's appreciation of nature, but if it reduces the chance of that child developing cancer in later life, then they may just support it. We need good thinkers who will not necessarily be biologists to take this message to the young people of the world. I appreciate organisms as individuals, and I take much greater care with the welfare of the animals I interact with than I did 50 years ago when I first started in biology. If you'd like to read about this evolution of a hunter to a photographer, you may take a look at some of these books which were written for general audiences. However, I hope I never lose sight of the wonder of biodiversity and biodiversity processes, even if it means that Bambi has to die.